Well, good Monday evening, everyone. Meteorologist Michael Wilhite here, SouthernIndianaWeather.com. I know what you're all wanting. You're watching this video and you're saying it's Christmas time. Make it snow. I wish that I could. Folks, we've got an interesting pattern setting up. I know that's why most of you are probably watching this video, because there's the potential for a snow-making kind of system here later on in the period. Unfortunately, while we know there's a storm there, a lot of the specifics aren't really in place yet. But we're getting there. We're a little bit closer on model agreement today than we were. So at least we got a good thing in that. First off, let's just talk about what we're a little more confident in, and that is that some temperatures are going to really absolutely just drop. I've been talking for the past couple of weeks now about how the EPO is going to go just obscenely into the negative. And whenever you get a tanking negative in EPO, East Pacific Oscillation, what you get is just a cold dump in the central part of the country that then sort of bleeds to the east and to the south. And it can get really cold. And then modeling is picking up on that. So the latest GFS modeling, and by the way, this is without a whole lot of snow on the ground down here over us. Now there's a good snowpack up here, but down over us, this would be without snow on the ground. And this is temperatures right around zero or even below zero in parts here. This would be for the 26th of December in the morning. If the GFS is right on that, that's pipe bursting cold. Is the GFS right on that? We'll see. I'm not sold on this yet. But the idea that you have this obscene cold showing up in the data is certainly troubling. Regardless, it's going to be cold either way you look at it. GFS has a cold almost all over the country here early next week. Miami's down at 70, so everybody else hate on Florida day is about what that's going to be. They're about the only warm part of the country here. You're talking ridiculously obscene cold. Temperatures close to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit as you go up here into northern Minnesota with a lobe of the tropospheric polar vortex coming down to visit us and give some trouble. Euro is not as bullish with the cold. It's still cold as well. But you notice there's a big difference between the Euro here and the GFS. The Euro has the cold front sort of right over in here somewhere. And there's a thick dividing line here with some warm into the southeast and some cold up in here. Whereas the GFS, you notice, is more extreme with the cold. Well, that's also, more extreme with the cold is also going to make a difference in solutions as far as for this storm. Because if you get too extreme cold, then what you have is a storm sort of being pressed off of the coast here and riding up in this direction. Whereas if you come more toward a Euro kind of solution and you got the front stalled out in here, then you can get a shield of precipitation somewhere up in here and actually get a storm rather than having it suppressed so far to our south. So how far these temperatures come in, how cold they are, all of this makes a big deal in trying to nail down the track of this storm system. Look how this is happening. The GFS, if we just go into the upper levels of the atmosphere, the GFS has a pretty suppressed southeast ridge over here, and there's your lobe of the tropospheric polar vortex just barreling on down here. And then you've got these pieces of energy sort of riding on up, and so you've got the cold just being dumped right down from Canada. Here's your southeast ridge over here, and it's just pretty much non-existent as far as anything we are. Now look at what the Euro model does for this same time period. This is Christmas morning, by the way. There's the GFS, here's the Euro, a much different look to it. Whereas the GFS is just the polar vortex comes to visit, centered right over Minnesota, and you know you've got this whole massive dump of cold right here over the center portion of the country. You come back to the ECMWF, the Euro model, and you see that the angle of this is much different. The lobe of the polar vortex is up here rather than down here. And, you know, what you have with the polar vortex being up here is now you have the center of the cold and core of the code being confined way up into here. Whereas, you know, it was more like this on the GFS. And so that makes a big difference here. So what you've got going on is you see this little piece of energy right over in here. That's your cold front. On the euro, the cold front is sort of stalled out in a fashion similar to this. And so whenever you've got this energy down here as rounding the base of the trough, you can get a low pressure to develop down here, and one or more, likely more than one piece of energy sort of ride up that, and that could put us here in the Ohio Valley at risk for some precipitation with this. Whereas on the GFS, what you have is the cold front stalling off way out here. And so by the time you get the energy rounding the base of the trough down here, your low is not going to develop until down here. And so you're going to get it to develop in this, and there's a risk that we could end up staying dry up in here as a result of that. So two very different solutions. Which one is going to be right? Well, at this point, we have to consider that both could be, but I think I'm going to lean more toward the euro at this point. For one, it's not as extreme, and for two, I think it fits the pattern a little bit better. Whenever you have a negative EPO, what does it usually do? If you've studied meteorology, you know that a negative EPO dumps cold in the central United States first and then bleeds it eastward. Well, if this is what you would see out of there, it's dumping it in the central part of the United States, but it's dumping it just as much over us, whereas the euro really fits that picture of a negative EPO more, where the major dump of the cold air is over here, and then slowly over the next 3 or 4 days it starts to spill that eastward. That's a little bit more what we usually see with this, and so that gives a little bit more leaning to the euro model. Also, if you just look at the Canadian, and you see the Canadian shows a very similar thing to the euro. So you got a couple of models indicating that, whereas the GFS is off on its own little solution there. So we will just have to see. Folks, the cold is coming either way. You notice here that, as I said, the euro, sort of stalls this front out over here. Doesn't take the cold coast to coast like what you see here on the GFS model. So we'll have to see when the time comes here. It's going to get cold no matter what, downright cold. You've got 50s to contend with this week. That's a nice thing. This is for Evansville, Indiana, the southern part of the state where I'm forecasting for 50s this week. By the time that cold front slides through on Friday, look, it's downhill. And look at this. You're talking single digits here on the modeling here early next week. And that's warm compared to some of the data that I showed you just a little bit earlier, below zero. Either way, ridiculously cold temperatures on the table here. And by the way, euro, this is the GFS. The euro is also in a similar thing. If you look at the euro here, you get the idea that you get that ridiculous cold coming in too. So I'm very confident there's some cold coming in next week. But let's talk about the storm systems, and let's sort of analyze this. So let's take a look at the GFS model just to show you what it's doing. This will start you out on Thursday, and so on Thursday you've got some precipitation here, some snow breaking off here, parts of Nebraska and Iowa, and then on up into Wisconsin, the upper peninsula there of Michigan. This sort of comes through, and here's your cold front sliding through on Friday. Cold air comes crashing in behind that. There are hints that maybe some wet snowflakes mix in, but nothing big at this point with that. That moves off then, and these blue lines, well, this is indicating of that cold air coming down, and again, you get that polar vortex coming down for a visit. And notice, instead of a vigorous system, what you've got going on here is this low develops out here, and it's just sort of rides up that stalled cold front, and all you're getting up in here is just a little narrow band of snow, and that's really just from a jet streak from strong winds right over us. It's not even connected to this. There's no phasing going on. This probably would not amount to much more than a dusting if it even reaches the ground, because that would be some very bone dry air over us. And then that would then on Christmas Day bring some snow up into the northeast. I'm not sure that I buy into that idea yet. If you look at the Canadian model, it has a little bit different take on this. So here's Thursday. There's that rain and that snow rather breaking out over there. Here you come on to the weekend system. It slows the front down, and so rather than coming through on Friday, it comes through on Saturday morning, but it has a pretty heck of a wet snowstorm here for us for parts of Illinois. Doesn't really come for southern Indiana, though. You see that sneaks off to the east, and you get some cold air coming in, but it's not angled nearly to the extreme way, because remember, the polar vortex is up here, as you can see on this particular model. The polar vortex is confined rather to up here rather than that. And what am I doing here? Hold on. There we go. I get my tools drawn on right. The polar vortex is sort of confined up in here rather than down here like the GFS had it. And so instead of the rain and the precip being down here, because it's up here, well, you've got a chance for these to sort of phase together and come a little bit more north there as a result of that. And there's what you see. You've got a low pressure that's developed down in here, but instead of going out this way, it's going up in a manner sort of like this, and that's going to allow for some precipitation. And so the Canadian model here would actually allow for us to have a little bit of some snow here on Christmas Day before it starts to move away in that. That's a reasonable solution. Now let me show you what the Euro model does with this. All right, let me pull up the Euro model here, and you can see. And so this, let me just sort of back this down so you can see the date ranges on here as well. So what we've got coming in here, this is for Thursday as well as I continue this on. There's your snow up into the northern portions of the plains, up there into up into the upper peninsula of Michigan and Wisconsin there. Rain breaks out for us here on Friday. The front moves through. Not really much happening with that, but then watch what happens. You've got a low pressure that's going to start to develop down here in the Gulf, and then where is it going to go here? You continue on with this, and you see they're not plotted on here, but you can see it's not developing it down into here. It's not a coast storm like what the GFS said. Instead, it's right up in our region, and you notice that it's if I had plotted it on here, you'd see that it's sort of riding up in a fashion similar to this. And so what it's doing is it's breaking out some snow and some ice on the back side of this system, and so it at least gives us something. And now let me just sort of say this as well. All of these models, I don't think are hinting at the right pattern yet. I really just don't. So in what you've got is you're going to have a huge, massive, high pressure come down here, squeezing some dry air in, but it's going to squeeze very cold air in with this. And so, you've got a high pressure down in here. They rotate clockwise around, and so you've got very cold air spilling down into here. But you've got very, very, very warm, moist air being pumped up from the Gulf of Mexico as a result of that. And so you've got a precip shield that sort of extends barely into Indiana here. But, to be bluntly honest about this, I would be surprised if you didn't see a precip shield extending a little bit more out like this. I really would, because oftentimes in a setup like this, the models, they don't show as much precipitation as what's really going to be there until a day or two before the storm. And so I think later in the week we might see this develop, but I would not be surprised if in this area right in here over us, you see some more precip develop. And if that is the case, we are on the cold side of the system. And you've got that, again, that high pressure pumping down very cold air from here. Well, what does that mean? So you've got the warm air in the upper levels of the atmosphere, and then you've got very cold air, if you will, being pumped down to here at the surface. Folks, that's a recipe for ice. Models are not really showing it for us yet, but I'm just telling you meteorologically, that's what happens more often than not. More often than not, in a setup with that, you end up with some icing concerns as a result of this. So just because the modeling isn't saying it for us yet doesn't mean it's there. There's going to be a lot of adjusting, but I will say this. This is the first time the Euro has had some run-to-run consistency with this. This is the morning Euro, and if I were to just sort of back up here and let me find the Euro from yesterday. There's the Euro from yesterday. From last night as a result of this, and so you can see it's very similar here. Let me just sort of do some finagling here, if you will, and get these down to size, put them side by side for you here, and then you can kind of maybe see just a little bit with this, and there you go, folks. You can kind of see some run-to-run consistency there. So this was the run from this morning. This was the run from last night. There again, you have that angle and everything consistent on it. It's nice to see some consistency here in the Euro. Now, will it stay that way? Well, we'll end up having to see. Let me show you this, though, before I end the video. The GFS, I do think, is having some problems. So this is the GFS idea of snow for that time. It takes a little bit of snow right up here over the Appalachian Mountains, basically, and leaves us with a light coating for some of us at the absolute best. But just sort of watch this. If you go back into the actual ensemble data here, its own model is not agreeing with its brothers. And so let me explain to you an ensemble. I had this question on Twitter earlier tonight. So an operational model is just one particular model run. So it's what you see right here. That's an operational model. It's ran one time, it's initialized, and it comes out with a result. But an ensemble is a little bit different. It takes that operational model, and what it does is it sort of tweaks things a little bit. It makes small little changes to the initial conditions and then runs them again, in this case 20 times. Because it does that, what happens is you are accounting for the fact that we don't have the atmosphere perfectly modeled. So we change just slight initial conditions. You can come up with 20 different solutions, and then you average them out to come with a mean out of that, and you can sort of average out the extremes. You can also look at the individual members and tell what the model is doing. Is there any consistency within the model? So think of the ensemble members here as sort of the stepbrother, if you will, of the operational model. And what you can see here is that all of these that I've got circled here, that is 7. That is 7 out of 20 members that are showing a pretty decent little storm system, a winter storm system over us in the ensembles. And the control is going... the control is just the operational run at a lower resolution. So that's 8 out of these showing some pretty hefty snow totals for us. All that to say, I don't know that the GFS has this right now. I don't think it's got a good handle on this system right now. I really think that the European model probably has the better handling on this for the time being. And so we'll sort of run with this idea for right now. This is not a forecast. I can't give you an accurate forecast this far out because the pieces of the puzzle aren't all there, but we're getting closer. And what I can say to you, and I'll sort of end with this, is if I were anywhere in the box that I am circling here, that is where I think you need to worry about some winter mischief coming from this storm. That's a pretty wide area. Hopefully we'll be able to narrow that down a little bit more with time. It could end up being rain, it could end up being nothing, it could end up being snow, it could end up being ice. But if there is a winter storm potential with this setup, folks, that's where my gut tells me it's going based off of all the data as we have it right now. Should be able to get a little bit more of this data worked out into some better agreement by Wednesday or Thursday. So check back and I'll have more videos for you a little bit later in the week.